It's great to be here. As Lorraine said, I'm based at Stanford University, where I direct my center's research portfolio around human trafficking. And I've been researching and working on issues of trafficking and labor exploitation for about a decade, with a focus on international policy implications. So this conference is really exciting to see so many faces of folks working on issues, diverse issues all around the world. So this really feels like a big moment, and I'm super excited to be chairing this final panel. Just want to thank everyone for their active participation these past 3 days, and of course to ILO, IOM, and IPA. It's just been really gratifying working with and learning from all these early career researchers. It's a member of the Scientific Committee for Research to Action. And I really hope folks will stay on after for the social event at the end of this panel. So this final panel, to me, is really about community, and in two senses of the word. So first, it could be how social relationships can both encourage or inhibit vulnerability to forced labor and child labor, say through community attitudes towards child domestic labor, or a given labor migrant's relationship to their trafficker or smuggler as they endeavor to exit conflict at home and find economic well-being elsewhere. The broad geographic scope covering Europe, Africa, and the Americas also allows us to consider how approaches in one place may work or not in other locales. I'm thinking about Kathy Zimmerman's keynote yesterday on that point. For example, in exploring the connection between foster care and trafficking in Haiti versus Sierra Leone. But this panel also really highlights the value of community, and that by creating this R2A initiative, the organizers have cultivated a learning environment, both for researchers and policymakers. For example, in the exploration of new methodological approaches. In these 4 studies alone, we see the application of various qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods approaches to data collected from surveys, focus groups, in-depth interviews, and key informant interviews. There's also been an opportunity to exchange learning on how the experiences of impacted communities can be well integrated into academic research, and an emphasis per Eric's opening day keynote on how to span the research to impact gap in shaping not only anti-trafficking policy, but wider approaches to immigration, education, and social programs, in a demonstration of the deeply structural drivers of the issues we've been discussing these past 3 days. So with that, I'm really pleased to introduce our first panelist. We will have 4 presentations of about 15 minutes each, and we'll save the final 20 to 30 minutes for Q&A. I invite our audience members to please leave your questions in the chat in real time, and we'll address those at the conclusion. Though if you have an urgent intervention, feel free to note that, and I'll try to gently interrupt our speaker. So with that, I welcome Holly Koogler to present her paper, Social Relationships and Child Labor Migration from Karamoja, Uganda, an exploratory study. Holly is currently a PhD student in sociology at Johns Hopkins University. Her doctoral research focuses on the transition to adulthood for disadvantaged youth in diverse settings. Over to you, Holly.
So I'll be presenting my study on the interplay between social relationships and child labor migration from Karamoja, Uganda. The objectives of the study were to investigate the social risk factors related to child labor migration from Karamoja, to explore peer relationships of child labor migrants from Karamoja, and then to propose policies and potential interventions that reflect these dynamics. The context of this study is Uganda, and then within Uganda, Karamoja, which is in the northeast corner of Uganda, and within Karamoja, Napak district, which is sort of the central part of Karamoja. And the context is really important for this study. Karamoja is the least economically developed region of Uganda. It's historically, people there practice pastoralism as a livelihood system, but decades of unrest and natural shocks have decimated the cattle livelihoods. But in the past, children would go and help with the cattle. They would help to watch them while they were grazing or move them to new areas. So there's this tradition of children participating in income generating activities, but with a lot less cattle opportunities there. There are significant migration of children within and from Karamoja. Karamoja children are visible in all major towns and cities in Uganda and many in Kenya as well. Now for the methods. I have two data sources for this study. The secondary survey data comes from a study focused on child trafficking that was funded by the Global Fund in Modern Slavery, and it was conducted last year by Makerere University. The sample size for that is 1,000 adults and 830 children aged 12 to 17. That study also gives some qualitative data from the open-ended responses. And then for this study in particular, we conducted 24 in-depth interviews with youth aged 13 to 21. Interview topics included labor migration history, information sources, expectations and realities upon arrival, friendship characteristics, and the expectations for the future. We also conducted 3 key informant interviews. The qualitative analysis was done in MaxQDA, and the quantitative analysis was done in Stata. And the data are weighted, so estimates are representative of adults and youth aged 12 to 17 in the PUC district. Now for my findings related to social risk factors. Unsurprisingly, a major driver of migration is poverty. It was mentioned in almost every interview. It came out in the survey responses as well. For example, an adult respondent was asked, who should make the decision about whether a child migrates for work? Should it be the child or the parent or community member? And she responded, no one decides. It's the hunger that chases the children away. Similarly, another adult, when asked what they would do if they had concerns about a child being trafficked, replied, hunger is the reason that children leave the village. With the implication being it's not that people are pulling them away, it's that they're being driven out by their hunger. And this is also reflected in the survey data. 69% of children went to bed hungry at least one night the previous week, and 27% of children went to bed hungry 3 or more nights. 20% of children believe that migrating is the only way to make enough money to survive. In the survey, we asked children, how many people can you rely on in a time of need? 1 in 10 said they could rely on no one or on one person. Half of the children said they could rely on 2 people. So this is a lot of children who have a very small sort of safety net. And if something happens to those 1 or 2 individuals they can rely on, they're kind of lost. And this is in fact reflected in the interview data. Many of the children who had migrated did so after the loss of a parent. 5% of children in the PUC district are maternal orphans, 13% are paternal orphans, and 2% are double orphans. One 17-year-old described how she had to start working at age 8 after both of her parents died. And a 14-year-old describes how she fetches water just to survive and take care of her younger brother. In addition to death, there are an absence of parents for other reasons. They can't take care of their children for whatever reason, or else they've gone somewhere else to look for income generating activities. And in some cases, it's as a result of polygamy, the father has moved on to a new family. And that actually came up in a lot of the interviews, that the father was no longer supporting the family because he had moved on to a new one. One respondent said, even our father left us and got another wife. No giving any help as a father. If you ask father, he will say, if you ask him, give me something because he has cows, he will say, you go and ask your mother, go to the grave and ask your mother. There were several other common themes looking at the drivers of migration. Insecurity came up a lot, especially for the male respondents. There's a lot of conflict in Karamoja, and boys in particular are targeted and feel unsafe. And so this drives them to move out. Girls in particular, several mentioned forced marriage, and so they left the region to escape being forced to marry someone they didn't want to marry. Illness came up in several of the interviews. It results in vulnerability, both because of the loss of the income that would be generated by the person who became ill or got hurt, and also because of the fees for their medical care and for travel to get medical care. For example, one respondent said, but on Friday, I told my mother, I'm going to Kampala. Then she replied me, now that you are going, who is going to cultivate the garden? Then I told her, what about that woman who is coming here daily to demand for the money that I used to take you to the hospital. There's nothing to give her, not even a cow. We have to pay her debt. Later in the interview, this same girl says, I even brought my sibling who is very young. I cannot manage to get that money alone. I need the help of the child. Now I shift to the findings related to child labor and peer relationships. Peers support each other in all kinds of ways. They share information about how to travel, where to travel, how to get the money to travel, in some cases contributing funds. They sometimes act as guides, going back to the village and bringing their friends or relatives or meeting them at the bus terminal. One respondent described how when he was coming from this rural area and he first arrived in Kampala, he was completely overwhelmed by the tall buildings and by all the people and by all the cars. And he was just frozen, stranded until his friend came and taught him how to navigate between cars so he could cross the street. Peers also provide all kinds of support for new arrivals. Often a migrant knows someone in the destination, but even if not, they seek out other Karamojans for help. Peers often provide an initial place to sleep when new arrivals get their bearings. They play a major role in orienting new arrivals to income generating activities. For example, one girl described how her peers told her how much she should earn for different kinds of domestic work and which kinds of jobs to look for. Another respondent talked about how he learned theft from some of his peers. He learned who to target and how to carry it out. And he even said, then I gave some money to my friend to say thank you for also teaching me. Another girl described how she was having a really hard time finding work. She didn't have some of the skills that her friends had. She tried winnowing wheat and she threw it up and it all just came back in her face. And so she was feeling really frustrated. And one of her peers heard of a woman who was looking for a domestic servant. And so she was connected with this woman and she came back and complained to her peers and said, this woman is too tough, but her peers had told her to endure it. So they're providing both material support, they're giving them connections to accommodations and to jobs, but they also give a lot of advice on how to survive in this context, both mentally and physically. Now for some conclusions and recommendations. First, let me note that the dominant programming to address child labor migration from Karamoja is awareness raising campaigns through local NGOs and community leaders. The narrative focuses on the risks to human trafficking and the dangers youth may face. However, migrants are getting most of their information from peers. Peers talk about where to go, how to go, but they also share horror stories, stories of organs being removed and beheadings and others. Through these discussions, youth are aware of these scary potential outcomes of migration, but they do it anyway. Consider this quote by a 19-year-old migrant. My child is here crying of hunger. I have nothing to give, so just look at all of that. What would you do if it was you? I decided to come. So in this context of hunger and insecurity, I argue that raising awareness of risks in the absence of improvements in drivers of migration is unlikely to be effective. My second conclusion relates to the first. Peers exchange advice and learn from each other. One example really highlights this fact. So this is the 17-year-old that I discussed on the previous slide who learned theft from his peers. He describes how he used to go to visit an NGO for meals, and they would hear some teaching like, you stop this and that. But he and his friends just went for the food and didn't listen. But at the present time, when this interview was conducted, he's no longer stealing things. And he had previously been doing drugs and he has stopped doing drugs. And when he describes his path to change, his story is filled with support from peers. Peers gave him advice on how to stop and alternative ways to generate income. Peers offered him support, such as a place to stay while he figured things out, and offered him food to eat. And it was through the support of his peers that he made these major changes in his life. My conclusion from this and other youth narratives is that identifying and employing peer networks is the most effective way to inform and change behavior. Return migrants could be leveraged in facilitating balanced, not scaremongering, discussions of the risks and benefits of migration. The information coming from peers, as long as it allows some discussion of these positives of migration, might help more accurate information spread as youth consider migration. Finally, formalizing peer support networks at major destinations could reduce vulnerability and prevent labor exploitation. This is already happening informally, but it could potentially be more systematic and effective with some outside support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Holly, for being prompt as well. I didn't even have to remind you of your 2 minutes. I think this point you raised again reminds me of Kathy's presentation yesterday, thinking through, common approaches such as awareness raising campaigns and whether that has been effective or not. So thank you for shedding light on new policy intervention ideas.